She's flying that thing. They laughed the moment she stepped onto the tarmac. A silver-haired woman walking alone toward an old AC-130 left to rust at the edge of the base. To them, it was nothing more than a relic from another era, slow, obsolete, and decades past its prime. No one understood why it had been pulled out of storage. No one asked why she had authorization to fly it. And by the time the skies blacked out, the comms failed, and the most advanced jets lost their way, she was already airborne, without orders, without backup, flying straight into a corridor no one else had ever come back from, except her. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we dive into this powerful mission, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And have you ever known someone who carried a story no one else believed? And if you think stories like this deserve to be heard, hit subscribe to support the channel. No one remembered her arrival. She hadn't flown an official mission in over 12 years. Her name wasn't even on the roster posted outside operations. The few who did recognize her didn't speak about it, not out of fear, but because she'd become a ghost of the base long ago. Lieutenant Colonel Helen Reeves had once been the Air Force's top gunship commander, a legend whispered about during late-night maintenance shifts, not for her medals or flight hours, but because of what wasn't in her file. Her career, while exemplary on paper, had entire sections redacted, missions listed with no location, reports sealed and resealed under multiple levels of clearance. No one knew exactly what had happened. They only knew she had once returned alone from a mission that had taken out 3 full birds and 16 men. Her presence on base now, unannounced, wasn't just unusual, it was an anomaly. She kept to herself, rarely left her quarters, and only showed up near the flight line when no one was watching. But word spread fast. Someone had spotted her in Hangar 4, running diagnostics on the AC-130 Spectre that had been collecting dust for nearly a decade. The aircraft had been written off, its systems outdated, airframe corroded in places, and barely compliant with modern avionics standards. Yet there she was, day after day, wiping down panels, testing the old gunship's pressure seals, replacing connections by hand, and soldering wires herself when the mechanic shrugged and said it wasn't worth the effort. The base's younger pilots, those fresh off elite programs, fluent in software-driven avionics and accustomed to touchscreen cockpits, couldn't understand why anyone would waste time on such a relic. The Spectre was a beast from another era, designed for close air support and surgical strikes in conflicts most of them only knew from documentaries. But to Helen, every bolt and rivet of that aircraft had a voice. She didn't speak about it, but when she touched the side of the plane, when she ran her palm along the weathered fuselage, it wasn't maintenance, it was memory. She wasn't fixing it, she was preparing it. Command noticed her presence, of course. Colonel Baird, the operations lead for the base, made a few polite inquiries, but received no real answers. The paperwork authorizing her return came from higher up, far higher. Not Pentagon, not NORAD, something buried deeper. Baird was no fool. He'd been around long enough to recognize when a door wasn't meant to be opened. Still, he kept one eye on the hangar and the other on his pilots, especially when the upcoming multinational exercise, a live simulation involving terrain penetration, low-visibility night operations, and rapid evac scenarios, was announced. The young guns on base were eager. Pilots from 3 different countries had flown in, all bringing sleek 5th-gen aircraft, Raptors, Typhoons, and advanced UAV support. The week before the op, the base buzzed with energy. Briefings ran non-stop, commanders held strategy meetings, and the flight line shimmered under heat and adrenaline. But no one gave a second glance to the AC-130 sitting alone at the end of the tarmac, framed by shadows, as if the sun itself had forgotten it was there. No one except the woman quietly inspecting its landing gear at 5:30 a.m. each morning before the others even brewed coffee. One night during a training simulation, something strange occurred. A mock convoy insertion failed, not because of enemy engagement, it was a controlled exercise, but because the air-to-ground interface failed to lock coordinates. All systems had been green, weather reports clear, and satellite feeds stable. Yet somehow, the data feed dropped at the exact moment the air-to-ground interface should have triggered. The failure was chalked up to interference, and a memo circulated reminding teams to double-check calibration protocols. But Helen knew better. She didn't say it out loud, but her expression shifted when the report was posted on the operations board. She stayed late in the hangar that night. Then came the real warning. 3 days before the official operation, weather anomalies appeared in the region. Unexpected heat surges, magnetic field fluctuations, and long-range radar disturbances. Meteorological Command dismissed it as temporary turbulence, but classified internal memos began to circulate. One in particular, marked with a seal Helen hadn't seen since the Cold War, confirmed her suspicions. The exercise wasn't just a drill anymore. Something was moving into the airspace not listed on any flight plan. The base prepared as normal. Fighters lined the runway. UAV teams calibrated targeting systems. Briefings intensified. Pilots recited call signs and rendezvous points like a chorus. But Helen remained silent. She hadn't been assigned a squadron. She hadn't even been issued a comms kit. She didn't ask for one. The AC-130 sat there, inert to everyone else, but ready for her. The techs laughed when she requested a legacy radio setup instead of encrypted uplink. That gear's been obsolete for 15 years, one said. She didn't respond, just installed it herself and ran a diagnostic. It worked. That morning, one of the younger pilots, Lieutenant Kai Bishop, strolled past her on his way to pre-flight. He was smart, talented, and deeply unaware of how little he understood about the things that didn't show up on HUD screens. He paused for a moment, then smiled with the false confidence of youth. "You really think that old bird's gonna keep up with 5th-gen stealth tech?" he asked, half joking. Helen didn't look up. "I don't plan on keeping up," she replied. "I plan on finishing." He laughed, thought she was being witty, and moved on. He would remember that line the rest of his life. By that evening, storm clouds gathered over the far range. High-altitude lightning danced without thunder, a rare phenomenon that made even experienced crews uncomfortable. Satellites reported a sudden blackout zone near the mountains. No signal in, no signal out. Command tried to redirect the exercise, but something in the system pushed back, literally. Nav systems recalibrated, real-time pointing aircraft back toward the blackout. It was like gravity for machines. Only one aircraft on the base had fully analog flight systems, and only one pilot on base had ever flown through a blackout zone and returned to tell anyone, and she hadn't told anyone what she saw that night. While the others scrambled to diagnose glitches and recalibrate systems, Helen rolled the AC-130 out of Hangar 4 under her own power. The groan of the airframe echoed across the flight line, a sound so out of place amid the whine of jet engines that several crewmen actually turned their heads. It was slow, heavy, deliberate, not elegant, but it moved with the certainty of something that had no doubts left to process. Colonel Baird stood on the control tower balcony and watched as the Spectre taxied without clearance. He didn't stop her. He didn't even pick up the radio. Some instinct told him this wasn't the time for protocol. Helen adjusted the controls, her hands steady. The storm overhead wasn't natural, she knew that now. And deep inside, as she reached for the switch marked Auxiliary Override, she felt the same stillness she had felt all those years ago, before the screams in her headset, before the static, before the horizon split open. She activated the analog radio, one frequency, only one that hadn't been used since 1983, and someone answered. The runway lights flickered once, then cut out completely, just as the AC-130 reached the hold short line. Not a power failure, no alarms triggered, no emergency backups kicked in, just darkness, as if the grid had been manually overridden. The tower tried to reach her, no response. She wasn't on their frequency, but somehow Helen knew she had clearance, not from the tower, from somewhere else. She taxied forward, the behemoth shuddering slightly beneath her hands, as if remembering how to move, like a muscle waking from deep sleep. The air around the aircraft had a strange texture to it now, as if the humidity had thickened into something heavier, more resistant. The storm overhead loomed, lightning rippling like veins through the night sky. No rain, no wind, just the electricity of something unnatural pressing in. Inside the Spectre, the cockpit lights glowed with a warm, analog hum. Dials spun smoothly, switches clicked with satisfying finality. Helen adjusted trim and flaps manually, checked the hydraulic pressure, and ignored the scrambled voice crackling faintly in her headset, someone trying to warn her off. She pressed a button on the side panel, not marked in any official schematic. A secondary transponder lit up, pinging a frequency that hadn't been used in 4 decades. No one else on base even knew that button existed. Back in the control tower, Baird leaned forward. His radar screen was blank where the AC-130 should have been. Even more alarming, other blips began to flicker. Aircraft in holding patterns above base reported navigational errors. GPS coordinates shifted. One drone spun mid-air and crashed in the desert just south of the perimeter. Radio sputtered nonsense, not static, something worse. Layered sound, incomprehensible transmissions looping in fractured patterns. Morse code hidden inside voice chatter. Latin phrases buried in system logs. The techs panicked. They checked the satellites. The feeds were corrupted. Baird stared at the tarmac. The Spectre was gone. No runway lights, no radar signature, just silence in the sky. The exercise had just begun. Squadron 1, made up of F-22s and Typhoons, entered the blackout zone first. Within seconds, comms failed. Their encrypted channels dropped to silence. Navigation displays blinked, lost all orientation, and aircraft began drifting in odd patterns, as though being drawn inward. Panic spread quickly, but without voice comms they couldn't coordinate. They were flying blind. Top-of-the-line jets, helpless in a sky that didn't behave. Inside her cockpit, Helen was calm. The AC-130 didn't rely on satellite anything. She used gyros, magnetic compasses, old-fashioned targeting optics, and decades of experience flying through worse. Her aircraft responded like it remembered her, hands adjusting trim with subtle resistance, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to live again. Her eyes scanned the dials. Everything was functioning perfectly, at least inside the cockpit. Outside, the clouds opened up, but not with lightning, something brighter, colder, more alien. She flew straight into it. Back on the ground, Bishop stood outside the hangar, his helmet under his arm, staring at the empty sky. His jet was grounded, so were half the others. The blackout zone was expanding fast, killing power to the northern runways and interfering with the automatic hangar doors. Maintenance crews scrambled to secure equipment. One of the tower officers collapsed mid-call, blood trickling from his nose, mumbling fragments of a phrase that didn't make sense. She heard it once already. She knows the corridor, before losing consciousness entirely. No one could explain it. The next hour blurred into chaos. 5 aircraft disappeared from radar. 4 reappeared, but had drifted more than 60 nautical miles off course. One pilot ejected, claiming his instruments were versed, and began guiding him toward the center of the storm against his input. The footage from his helmet cam was pulled immediately and locked. The footage of the AC-130? There was none. The old bird had vanished. But Helen wasn't lost, far from it. She was exactly where she needed to be. At 19,000 feet, she adjusted course by hand, flipping open a small compartment above the main panel where she'd hidden a laminated map, one no longer issued. It showed coordinates, scratched in pencil, with a ring drawn in red ink. No satellite markers, no topography, just one phrase written in the corner, in a code used during the Cold War. Transit corridor, use only once. She'd used it once, and it had cost her everything. As she approached the edge of the corridor, a low rumble passed through the airframe, not from engines, but from outside, like sound vibrating against the skin of the aircraft. Her eyes narrowed. She reached to her left, pulled open a second locked case bolted to the floor. Inside 3 sealed envelopes, one marked Primary Recovery, one Emergency Disclosure, and one with no label at all. She took the unmarked one, opened it slowly, and read the single line inside. "They will not remember unless you bring back the sound." It was an order, or a reminder. At that moment, the AC-130's systems flickered, not failed, just pulsed, as if acknowledging the message. The cameras on board activated, not by her, by themselves, and in the belly of the aircraft, a device long thought dismantled began to hum. Outside, in the blackout zone, clouds folded in on themselves, strange patterns emerged, the kind that no weather system should make. Spiral arcs, symbols, frequencies, only visible through analog thermal filters. The aircraft detected nothing, but Helen saw them. She'd seen them before. They had hovered above her the last time she flew this route, the time her crew didn't come back, the time the Spectre landed alone. The fuselage scorched and its data core encrypted with a language the Pentagon had never been able to decode. They thought she had hallucinated a stress fracture in her mind after a failed mission, but they'd never asked why the plane kept broadcasting long after it was powered down, or how its sensors picked up signals that weren't on any known spectrum. They buried the report, grounded the bird, transferred her, silenced everything. Until now. She took the Spectre deeper into the corridor. Inside the belly of the plane, the sound began. It wasn't music. It wasn't even a tone. It was memory. Audio fragments filtered through military encryption, laced with voices of man long dead. Her crew, their final transmissions lost but recorded by the aircraft itself. She could hear them now. "Reads, coordinates unstable. My HUD's not... Did you see that? Something outside. It's not a mayday. Spectre 4 going down. Repeat, going..." She closed her eyes, not in pain, in acknowledgement. The AC-130 wasn't haunted. It remembered every click of a switch, every bolt she had replaced, every diagnostic she had run. This wasn't repair. It was resurrection. She activated manual payload control. The bay doors opened mid-flight. Nothing dropped. Instead, the aircraft emitted a low-frequency pulse. Not a weapon, a beacon. Back at base, every power grid surged, then went dark, and just as the generators kicked on, the Spectre reappeared on radar, not where it should be, but directly above the command tower. The AC-130 hovered above the command tower, impossibly stable, unmoving against the push of crosswinds that had grounded every other aircraft from the control room. Colonel Baird stood frozen, eyes fixed on the radar screen and the impossible blip blinking over his own head. His crew spoke in hushed tones behind him, scared to say what they all knew. The Spectre was flying without visible propulsion, adjustment, maintaining altitude in a pattern no one had ever logged. Its IFF transponder wasn't transmitting standard codes. Instead, it was repeating a 4-digit sequence no one recognized, until one of the senior technicians leaned forward and whispered, pale-faced, "Sir, that's not a code, it's a date." The room went silent. Baird didn't speak. He remembered that year. Everyone old enough in the chain of command did. It was when an entire division of aircraft vanished during a classified Cold War exercise over the Atlantic. Officially ruled as a training incident in hostile weather, the files were sealed tighter than nuclear launch protocols, but those who had read the summaries, people like Baird, knew it was one of the blackest operations in Air Force history. The entire squadron disappeared without a trace, no wreckage, no signal, no survivors, except for one aircraft, except for one pilot, Helen Reeves. And the plane above them right now was the exact same bird. Baird turned from the screen and rushed out of the tower, down 3 flights of metal stairs into the blinding wind. As the Spectre held position above the tarmac, its floodlights activated one by one, illuminating the base in brilliant white beams cutting through the storm like spotlights from another world. They weren't scanning, they were remembering. Below, Pilots, engineers, officers, everyone on base emerged from hangars and shelters to witness the scene. No one spoke, no one dared move. Helen Reeves was back, and whatever she had brought with her wasn't done. Inside the cockpit, Helen sat steady, her gloved hands on the throttle, eyes locked forward. She wasn't flying manually anymore. The aircraft was doing that on its own. The old systems had integrated with something beyond their design, something not listed in any technical manual, something only she had ever seen before. She pressed a small switch beneath the control panel marked CTM, Cognitive Telemetry Mode. It activated instantly. The screen beside her began displaying moving text, not in English, not in any known military code. The symbols resembled runes, curves and spiked glyphs rotating like gears in a locked chamber. The sequence finished and a small light turned green on the central console. In the belly of the aircraft, something unlocked. Back on the ground, Baird had reached the center of the tarmac. The Spectre slowly began to descend, not with the inertia of a heavy gunship, but with a grace that defied physics. Its landing gear touched the concrete with a softness that seemed deliberate, respectful. As it rolled to a stop, the engines remained on idle, but the ramp at the rear began to lower. Everyone waited. No one dared move closer. And then, from the light inside the aircraft, something stepped forward. Not a weapon, not a drone, not a crate. A man, or at least a silhouette. Tall, rigid, dressed in a flight suit from another era. His face was shadowed, his movements precise as he stepped onto the ramp. The crowd instinctively parted, not because of fear, but recognition. Some of the oldest veterans on base stepped back. One of them, an aircraft mechanic in his 70s who'd been kept on contract as a technical consultant, dropped to his knees. "God in heaven, that's Captain Linwood," he whispered. "But he died." Helen followed the figure down the ramp. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The Spectre had remembered, and now it was restoring. The man didn't walk further. He stood at attention at the edge of the ramp, unmoving, staring ahead with perfect stillness. His presence wasn't spectral. He cast a shadow. The air around him shimmered faintly like heat distortion, but there was no heat. Baird stepped forward. "Colonel Reeves," he said, voice low, "what is this?" Helen turned to him slowly. Her expression wasn't triumphant. It wasn't even proud. It was exhausted, but clear. "You grounded it," she said, "after it brought me home. After it held their last transmissions, after it recorded their deaths. You shut it away like a cursed relic. But it wasn't cursed. It was waiting. Waiting for what? For them. To finish." Baird looked at the figure. "Who is that?" "He's the one who died saving us on the last flight. The others, they didn't die in the storm. They were pulled into something else. A corridor. Temporal. Artificial. Engineered, I don't know what by. I only know the Spectre kept part of them in memory. Coded into telemetry."
Audio echoes unprocessed data fragments that no one wanted to believe were real. She stepped forward, her boots echoing on the concrete. Until 2 days ago, when that corridor reopened, same coordinates, same signature, and every jet that flew near it got dragged sideways. But this one, she gestured to the AC-130, this one already knew the path because it had walked it once. Baird's voice was almost a whisper. "How did you come back the first time?" Helen didn't answer right away. She looked at the aircraft. Her hand reached out, gently brushing the side panel near the crew door. Then she finally said, "I didn't. Not really. I just arrived first. It's taken them 40 years to catch up." At that moment, the figure on the ramp saluted. A perfect, crisp, textbook Air Force salute. Baird returned it instinctively, not out of protocol, but out of something deeper. Reverence, awe, maybe guilt. The figure stepped back inside the Spectre, slowly, without a word. Helen turned to the crowd behind them. "It's not over," she said. The corridor is still open, and now that the aircraft has reenacted, the others may still come through. But it had to re-establish memory first. It had to return the one who stayed behind to hold the door open. Then, as the crowd processed the impossible, a second light appeared in the sky. It wasn't a jet, it wasn't on radar, but it moved exactly like the Spectre had. Silent, smooth, deliberate. And this time, the voice that broke through on the radio was familiar to Helen. It said, "Spect 4, requesting landing clearance. Colonel Reeves, we followed your trail." For the first time in recorded history, the base went completely silent, not from power failure, but because every man and woman present knew they were witnessing something that defied all prior understanding of flight, command, and time. The second aircraft descended without sound. No landing gear roar, no engine whine. It simply glided into place beside the AC-130 and stopped, as if the runway had been made for it. It wasn't marked, no serial number, no tail insignia, just a dull, matte skin as if the airframe had been scrubbed clean of its own identity. But those who watched it descend didn't need numbers to recognize its shape. The design matched an experimental variant of the EC-130 that had supposedly never flown, canneled due to structural instability during high-altitude acceleration. But Helen had seen it before, once, on the other side of the corridor. The ramp lowered. Inside stood 4 figures. They walked out one by one, disoriented but upright, flight suits from the early 80s intact, faces pale but familiar, and then a 5th. He moved slower, leaning slightly on the frame of the aircraft, looking around as if the sunlight stung his eyes. Baird didn't recognize him at first, but Helen did. Her breath caught, and her hands, which had remained steady through everything until now, trembled slightly. "Wexler," she whispered. He looked up. "Reeves." His voice cracked, dry and unreal. She nodded slowly. You're late." A weak smile broke through his cracked lips. "Didn't want to miss the landing party." The ground crew moved instinctively, helping the men from the second aircraft, wrapping blankets around them, taking vitals, scanning badges. But none of it would make sense. These men were ghosts, declared KIA 42 years ago, lost in a mission no one ever understood, in an aircraft no one admitted existed. And now they were standing on the tarmac, flesh and blood, disoriented, blinking, speaking English, remembering only pieces, but they were real. The medics tried to separate Helen from them, insisted she undergo evaluation protocol, psychological screening, but Colonel Baird stepped in and overruled it. "Let her walk," he said. "She brought them home." And so she did. They walked together, Helen and the men she'd left behind, through the center of the airbase, past the stunned faces of young pilots who had once laughed at the old woman and her museum piece, past the engineers who had refused to work on the aircraft, past the staff sergeants and generals who now stood at full attention without being ordered to. At the edge of the parade ground stood the memorial wall, rows of engraved names etched in stainless steel under a canopy of the American flag. The section marked September 1983 held 23 names, all of them presumed dead, all of them officially buried in empty coffins. Families had been given folded flags and standard-issue apologies, their service records sealed, their deaths unexplained. Helen stood in front of the wall. Wexler stepped beside her. He reached out with his left hand, the one with a scar she remembered too well, and touched his own name. A faint breeze stirred the air, not the wind of a desert gust, but something calmer, a kind of breath. The base watched as the man turned toward the wall and whispered something no one else could hear. Helen turned to Baird. "I need one thing," she said. "Anything." She pointed to the hangar. "Open a file, not digital, physical."
You'll find it inside a black case marked Echo Recovery Protocol. It's buried under the starboard floor panel, forward compartment. It's not listed in any manifest." Baird didn't question it. Minutes later he returned with a thin case, dust-covered, warped by time, but intact. He handed it to her. She opened it on the spot. Inside, a cassette tape, a logbook, and a folded letter marked with a seal from the Department of Defense, dated September 20th, 1983. She pulled the letter out first, read it silently, then passed it to Baird. He read only the first line. "Should this ever be opened, it means they found their way back." She inserted the cassette into a restored analog player that had been wheeled out for media archiving. Pressed play. At first, nothing but static, then voices, not recordings, live transmissions, faint, layered, as if someone else was still out there, mid-flight. "Spec 3, we're seeing you now, confirming proximity, 5 clicks out. Negative visual, cloud density increasing, we're flying blind. Reeves, are you there? Are you—" Helen turned the volume down and looked at Baird. "They're still coming." Baird said nothing. The next day, the Department of Defense arrived in unmarked SUVs. So did 2 senators. So did someone from the NSA and another from an agency Baird had never even heard of. But they didn't try to shut things down. Not this time. Not when half the base had witnessed the impossible. Not when too many questions had already taken root. Instead, they quietly began debriefing, isolating key personnel, gathering statements. But they didn't question Helen. They let her go. She walked back to the AC-130, climbed the ramp one last time, and sat in the pilot's seat alone. The engines were off, the systems powered down, but as she rested her hands on the controls, the dials flickered, and she smiled. Because the Spectre remembered. And now so did everyone else. 1 week after the incident, the base entered a rare moment of total stillness. No drills echoed across the tarmac, no engines tested, no boots marched at 0600 hours, sharp. The hangar doors opened slowly, revealing the AC-130, now silent, grounded, and stripped of all identifying numbers. She had flown her final mission, and though no official report had been filed, every airman and officer on the base understood they had witnessed something extraordinary. The aircraft, once mocked as a relic, now sat like a monument, its metallic skin weathered, burnished by storms that never showed up on radar, and marked not by battle scars, but by memory. Colonel Baird stood alongside the main runway, his dress uniform crisp, his expression unreadable, while a line of officers flanked him on both sides. Just behind them stood Helen Reeves, no longer wearing flight gear, but instead a plain, utilitarian jumpsuit. No decorations, no patches, only a nameplate tucked discreetly into the seam above her heart. She looked thinner than before, like the mission had taken something physical from her. And yet her presence was even heavier now, more anchored. What had once made her invisible now made her undeniable. Behind her, 5 men stood in uniform, impossible men, back from a mission they never returned from. The crew of Spectre 4, long presumed dead, now alive and silent, blinking into daylight like war-weary ghosts stepping across a bridge no one else could see. They said little in the days that followed. Some couldn't remember details, others remembered too much. But all of them had one thing in common. They followed Helen like they had never left. No words passed between them, they didn't need to. Their return had broken history, but none of them cared about making sense of it. They cared only about standing here, on solid ground, in the daylight, next to the woman who had refused to forget them. Then came the sound of marching boots, measured, solemn, unmistakably formal.
A full Joint Service Honor Guard approached from the far end of the base, followed not by reporters but by civilians. Wives and sons and daughters and brothers holding flags, faded photographs, increased letters, once believed to be the last trace of men long gone. Among them walked a woman in her 80s, gripping the dog tags of her twin brother. Another held a folded flag she'd never opened. They weren't here to ask questions. They were here to see with their own eyes what had been denied them for over 40 years. As the families gathered, the flight crew stepped forward one by one, meeting the eyes of those who had waited. There were no speeches, no formal ceremony, only embraces, tight, unshakable, trembling moments of recognition too sacred for words. The silence was heavier than any sound, and still no one moved toward the aircraft. It sat behind them, ramp open, floodlights off, engines cold, as if it, too, was waiting for something. Finally, Helen stepped forward. In her hands she carried a steel plaque. No shine, no polish, just 4 words etched by hand. She approached the front of the aircraft, placed the plaque under the pilot's window, and with a rivet gun she had personally requested from the archive, pressed the steel into place. The sound of the gun echoed across the base. One clean impact, then another, then a third. She didn't turn to look at the crowd. She simply stepped back, nodded once, and walked away. On the plaque, only this was written: "We came back together." The formation of service members standing across the flight line snapped to attention. No command was given, no officer raised a hand. It happened like instinct. It wasn't protocol, it was reverence. Every man and woman, regardless of branch or rank, raised a salute toward the old aircraft. It wasn't for the plane, it was for what it did, and who it brought home. Later that evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and cast long shadows across the now quiet base, Helen sat on the edge of the Spectre's lowered ramp, legs hanging slightly above the concrete, her back against the frame. She knew better than any home she'd ever known. Colonel Baird approached without speaking, settling beside her with a sigh, too tired to be formal. "They're debriefing everyone," he said, after a pause. "But the questions they're asking don't fit the answers we have." He waited. "And what about you?" She glanced at the horizon. "They'll let me go. There's nothing left to ask. They don't want to know, not really." He nodded slowly. "Will you stay?" She didn't respond right away. Her fingers traced the edge of the ramp like a musician playing the last note of a long-forgotten song. "No," she said finally. "She's done. And so am I."